Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Stubbs Book Club. I am Sardonic Stubbs, and today I want to talk about something a little different, a little less specific. Today I'm talking about graphic novels. And I'm using the term graphic novel because it's a bit more general than terms like comics or manga, and it's important for this episode. Today I'm talking about a concept that's more present in all fiction, and that's kind of characterization. So Stan Lee recently passed away. And while I'm not a huge fan of Marvel Comics, as you could probably tell from that superhero podcast we did a while back, I thought I'd put aside my bias and try to dive into the world of Spider-Man. Well, I went to my local comic shop and asked the man running the counter if he could, I asked him, "I'm looking for Spider-Man. What do you recommend?" Well, my plebe status kind of showed off right there, because I didn't realize that Spider-Man has an illustrious history spanning multiple decades. And after realizing I had swallowed my whole damn foot, I decided I'd pick up a copy of The Amazing Spider-Man: The Gauntlet, Volume 1. Now, I have to unveil to you that my background, big surprise, is in manga, and more specifically, shoujo manga, literally girls manga. Now, for the uninitiated among you, manga and Western comics are very different because they grew up in different environments. You even read them differently. To say that reading Spider-Man is about as opposite of what I'm used to as you can get, it's kind of an understatement, to the point to where I have to actually actively remind myself that I am reading this left to right and not right to left. I actually ended up getting a little dizzy because my eyes just aren't used to reading images left to right anymore. However, as I kind of got past the motion sickness of reading Western comics, I kind of discovered a problem that I have, not just with Western comics, but with all fiction. Characterization. It's not a unique problem in Western comics, but it's just very pronounced in Western comics. And it's part of the reason I think a lot of people shy away from comic book reading, is because a lot of these characters have changed so much over the years that it's difficult to understand where to begin. If you were to start with Batman, for instance, do you start at Detectives Comics number 1? You could, but that's definitely not an accurate depiction of what contemporary Batman is. And that was a problem I was facing when I was reading The Gauntlet. Peter Parker was still, for the most part, Peter Parker. He was kind of a smart-ass superhero-type character. But there was something just vaguely missing, it felt like. I felt like I was lacking character for Peter Parker. And that's hard to describe. I'm in very much essence saying that Peter Parker felt like a shallow, hollow character, and that's clearly not true. Somebody who's a fan of Spider-Man knows this isn't true, but it's how I felt reading it. And I would probably point to it being because I'm reading The Gauntlet, which is very villain-focused, but it was all they had for me to read. That's how it felt. And I wondered if it was maybe just Spider-Man, maybe it was just this comic, so I dug through other comics that I could find. Thank God for the internet. And I found that there was kind of a similar thread here. There's a lot of superheroes in Western comics who don't feel like real characters. And I guess the way I would describe it is that when I read characters in any fiction, there's many of them who sort of feel like they exist in a nebulous space, where the theme that their character's meant to represent is kind of allowed to do most of the work for the character. Now, I don't want to make this sound like I hate Western comics or that I am a weeb supremacist, because the reality is I do love Western superheroes, Spider-Man included. However, I just feel like there are so many moments where genuine character building can occur, where we sacrifice that in order to perpetuate the image of the character. It's actually one of the reasons I love Watchmen. Yes, every character in Watchmen exists as part of a large ideological framework that Alan Moore is perpetuating, but there's a realism to the characters. They have human qualities, they have flaws, they have genuine moments where you can kind of understand them. Alan Moore is really good at this, by the way. His other big work, the one that I would say that he's more famous for Watchmen, but a lot of people would say this is another one of his big pieces, was The Killing Joke. Another great example of characterizing a character who is pretty synonymous with not being able to be characterized. The Killing Joke, painting an image of the Joker's backstory, gives you an idea of the clown prince of crime that both enables you to understand his motivations while at the same time not making him too empathetical to the audience. In fact, the identity that The Killing Joke creates for the Joker is one that has been used and reused so many times since then that it's almost become synonymous with the character. And I guess this prompts the real question. What is it that makes characters feel real? That's a hard question to answer. Acts of humanity might mean more for one character than it does for another. And I think one of the things we have to start and look at a very basic level is that characters in fiction are extraordinary. Whether it is because they themselves are extraordinary or whether they exist in a setting that is extraordinary, it is important to remember that fictitious characters live lives that normal people do not. And so what does it that makes a character feel human again once you've made them extraordinary? There's another YouTuber. His name's Super Eye Patch Wolf, one of my favorite people on YouTube, in fact. He did a topic on this. He broke it up into heroes and villains, thinking that there might be a big difference. However, I find that a character, regardless of their moral or ethical implications, share that concept of being extraordinary in the perception of the audience. And I think to humanize a character means to understand the uniqueness of the character themselves. I'm going to use Batman again as an example. There are countless scenes of Batman doing the extraordinary. Beating up bad guys, sneaking around people who shouldn't be able to be snuck around, outsmarting sociopaths with genius-level intellects, committing feats of impossibility. The reality is behind Batman is that he's the superhero without superpowers, but in many ways it's hard to believe that he doesn't have some superpower with how he is constantly able to achieve the extraordinary. So, what is the scene that I think is the most important to Batman, one that stands out more than anything else? Ironically, I think it comes from a cartoon. Justice League Unlimited, in the very last episode. And I know this is a book club episode, but this is a comic book character, so I'm entitled to quote things that might not be from literature. If you're familiar with it, then you know what I'm talking about. You know this scene because it's hard not to remember this scene from the end of Justice League Unlimited. I am adverse to spoilers on this show, so if you have not seen this, go see it. Watch this episode. The great part about it is that it's standalone, so you don't have to watch everything up to this point. You can just watch this one episode, and you'll be fine. But for those of you who do know what I'm talking about, you understand that that scene, the thing that Batman does, is... it's not a scene where he's beating up bad guys. It's not a scene where he's outsmarting a person. It's a scene where he does something that no other human did for someone. An act of humanity for a person who I think needed it more than anything else. It's a scene like that that defines a character, because that's not an extraordinary thing. That is a thing that anyone could do. But Batman, the extraordinary, did it. A similar moment occurs in the manga Berserk, where Guts has just slayed 100 men in a single night. This is another great scene, and I'm okay with spoiling this one because you've had 30 years to read this. At this point, if you haven't read it, it's your fault. He slayed 100 men, but upon reflection of that night's events, Guts comes to a realization. His strength serves no purpose. That any extraordinary act of war that he achieves is nothing more than a random act, because he serves no cause and he doesn't have a reason of his own to fight. It's a moment that shows that despite all of his strength, that Guts lacks the power to do anything. And that's a theme that defines his character. Guts is extraordinary, but he is weak. He doesn't have the power to protect, to save, to do anything, but he has the strength to do anything that we would want. It's a sad but very humanizing thing, and that is very different than an act of humanity that is shown from Batman, because an act of humanity from Guts doesn't mean the same thing. We know that he's a human character. They've gone through an exceptional amount of time to prove to us that he is powerless in the face of the supernatural. But I think that's what characterizes it. Being human is not a simple thing. Being real is even harder. And I think that it is important to understand that what makes a character feel real is not formulaic. It is not something that is easy to define, but rather it is something that is defined by the character itself. What is the act of extraordinary that that character achieves? And then what is the ordinary thing that they do that makes them real? Superman's a great example of this, actually. Superman's probably the best example of this, because Superman is the most extraordinary. I'm not sure if you can quantify extraordinary into a scientific level, but if you could, then Superman would be pretty much near the top. Because he is invincible. He is strong. He is the kind of character who, whether or not he wins is not a question of if, rather a question of how. So then what makes a character like Superman feel real? Well, his struggles are intrinsic. The reality is that you don't have to have superpowers to feel like you don't belong somewhere, to feel unwelcome. Being different, even if it's in a good way, can be as much of a burden as being normal. I think one of the hardest things an author has to overcome is making their characters feel real, and obviously to some extent the fantasy of writing and the ideological motivations of an author always affects their work. However, I think the greatest characters are the ones that feel like they really do exist in some ways, even if they only exist as characterizations of part of who we are. Thank you for joining me on my little tangent. I've been Sardonic Stubbs. This has been the Book Club. And join us again next week with Anime with Stubbs.